Okay. For some, good morning. For some, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining this event with Mary and I. We're actually really excited to be here. In fact, we were just saying to each other that it's amazing how even talking back and forth between each other, there's a lot that we learn through sharing. So we truly are hoping to do that with you today, is to share our thoughts, what we are seeing, trends, insights, feedback. But before we do that, it'd be great for you to know who you're looking at here on screen. So Mary, if you'd like to kick things off, please do.
Sure. Thank you, Ed. Um, my name is Mary Larson. I'm a partner in the consulting practice of MNP. I'm the national leader of our strategy practice and spend probably most of my time working on issues around business sustainability, ESG, and equity, diversity, and inclusion as two critical issues that are facing businesses today. I think the things that I find is that looking at EDI and looking at ESG as not reporting requirements and not compliance issues, but really looking at them as strategic business opportunities and risks is something that is terribly important for all businesses today and increasingly so. So over to you, Ed.
Hey, thanks, Mary. Hi, everybody. My name is Edward Olson. I'm a partner here at MMP. I lead our national ESG practice, but ESG on its own cannot achieve anything without strategic insight and direction and focus, which is why Mary and I seem to be more tied at the hip than not for how do we coordinate on this very important topic that we're going to be addressing with you today. So I look at it in terms of everything from greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprint, decarbonization strategies, carbon credits and offsets, all the way through to how do we evaluate the implications of supply chains, which we will be talking to you about today. It really is quite encompassing around well, what are the risks and opportunities? What's the direction we set? What is that strategy that links Mary and I together? And ultimately, how do we deliver and communicate that message? That's really important. So we want to talk to you about some of those influences today. Before we do, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We love feedback. We absolutely love it. There's a Q&A button on your screens that if you have a question, please, by all means, put it into the question and answers. We will try and address those throughout. I'd rather be doing that while it's live so that you can see a direct response to questions you might have to the content that you're going to see or hear today. And we're going to try and get to as many of those questions as we can, but we know we are on limited time and want to respect your time. So at the top of the hour, we will be closing out. If there's anything that hasn't been addressed and you have provided your name, we will get back to you on that. And there is a recording that's happening right now. So this webinar will be emailed to you as a follow-up. So in case you didn't see something or wanted to hear it again or just want to see Mary again, then that's great. We'll make sure that you've got this link. One other matter as well, the environment of ESG changes daily. And where we are involved, we're involved on a global perspective in global committees. We're involved in national committees. We are involved with different partners in our Praxity Alliance. Every day from a legal perspective, a regulatory perspective, a disclosure from a voluntary perspective, that changes the disclosure environment. So while what we address today is pertinent as at this point in time, always consider it can change by tomorrow. So again, maybe that's a good thing to say. Call us back if you have more questions, but completely be watching what is translating into changes here for our Canadian economy, even as we go throughout this year. So speaking about that, when we look at the Canadian economy, and we have a complete appreciation that for many of you, your small and mid-sized enterprises in Canada. So when we look at that mid-market sector, which is the primary driver of this economy, it's really important to say, well, ESG doesn't really matter, does it? Well, no, Mary, I'm not going to ask that question because we do know it does. But what we want to do is we want to get into the idea of, well, what are those drivers that are really forcing us to consider this? And where do we even start unpacking some of that? That's what we want to cover. And then we're going to get into even more specific requirements around what many of you may be joining us for, Bill S-211, which is the Supply Chains Act, looking at the fight against forced and child labor. So there's a couple components around the state of ESG in Canada, and we're going to be moving over to Bill S-211. And I'm sure when we move into it, there's going to be a lot of questions on that perspective.
Mary. There already is one. there already is one, but we'll get to that when we get to S211. So
Oh,
there's already a question.
I do see it. Sorry. Thank you. Jake, it's gross. And I know you didn't want to hear that, but it's gross. Yeah. Thank you very, very much. So please use the Q&A chat. I really do love that. So Ed and Mary, what are you thinking in terms of access to capital? The one thing that surprises me, either you might know or you might not, but the ability to access capital, you need cash flow. You go to your bank and you're looking for a loan. The Net Zero Banking Alliance that banks in Canada have committed to are really quite significant around the expectations of reducing what they call financed emissions. So there's two things that a bank has to do. They have to look at, is there an exposure to climate in the Canadian economy, and what does that impact to the financial system? And at the same time, every dollar that I lend out, there is an emission that comes back to me as the lender that I have to account for. Now, why do they care? Because in the Net Zero Banking Alliance, they have committed to net zero financed emissions by 2050. And they've said we want to cut those emissions in half by 2030. So for every dollar that you need to access, there will be the question back around, well, wait, there's a climate component of this. What are the emissions you have that attribute back to me that comprise my financed emissions? So here's the one thing that I'll tell you. Is it happening to every small, mid-sized enterprise or the mid-market in Canada right now? No. In fact, moving the dial, the banks are focusing on the larger entities. That does not mean that they're not starting to ask for this information, and we've been seeing it. It's now a matter of understanding, well, wait, if they're going to be needing that in order for me to get a loan, to assess even my ability to exist in all the new climate-related physical events or a transition to a low-carbon economy, how do I get prepared to understand what that disclosure is, what they need from me? Because if I have an emission that goes back to them and they're trying to cut their financed emissions, there's a direct link between your ability to access money and capital and their ability to hit their targets that they've committed to. So when I talk about this idea of financed emissions, it's basically, I gave you $1, your business created an emission, that emission comes back to the bank in the percentage of their loan to your overall asset value. So just it's the consideration at a high level that this banking commitment and where the economy is transitioning is coming with more questions that each one of you are going to have to be prepared to answer. So Mary, capital markets to you.
Well, yeah. And so the same thinking is applying to the capital markets. So I think any of you who are listed on the public stock exchanges, there is a requirement to comply with ESG disclosures. So the CSA has laid out those requirements, and I think it's quite clear that these are linked up with the TCFD pillars, basically. They're looking for reporting on strategy, environmental issues, governance, and those kinds of things. And there are definite requirements that have been laid out quite clearly that you need to comply with. The other thing, though, is that I think that what we're seeing as well is the capital markets are looking at their investment at the same kind of scrutiny that the banks are. So they're saying that, if we're going to be giving money to organizations, we're under similar pressures from the sources of those funds, basically. And we're having to report as to what we're doing from a capital market standpoint. So I think what we're seeing is if you're not a publicly listed company and the CSA has not required you to report, what is beginning to happen is the companies that buy your goods, the organizations that fundamentally provide capital to you are being forced to report. They are ultimately going to be looking for information from you. And it's best to get ahead of the game. It's going to happen. It hasn't happened quite yet, but I think especially if you're an exporter, especially if you're a business that is looking to grow by finding new customers overseas, this would be something that I would be trying to get ahead of the game on. And so that when it does hit from a formal standpoint, you're ready and raring to go.
Yeah, and Mary, there was a question that David had asked too in the Q&A about Scope 3 emissions. And David, you're hitting this nail directly on the head. Until there's an expectation that's been set as mandatory in the capital markets for what disclosures are, then it is open for interpretation. People are self-selecting out of scope 3 emissions what's important to them and what they're going to quantify. There's emission factors that are being built on assumptions as opposed to actual data. So there is a lot of question marks around the validity, the accuracy, or even the veracity of those models and the reporting. 100% agree. When we looked at that banking example originally, their scope 3 emissions, the indirect emissions that gets attributed to them on every dollar of a loan that they issue, that scope 3 is your scope 1 and 2. So it's interesting to watch. They need it. It's how well are we articulating and quantifying and communicating that. When we look at even companies who are starting to set, regardless of what the capital markets are up to, we are setting our own voluntary targets. If you want to participate in my supply chain, here's what I'm going to need from you. That's being very specific around what they're going to request of you. So it's an evolution from voluntary, and we're going to soon see an environment where what will be mandated into the capital markets, it's going to trickle down across the supply chain and hit that entire mid-market sector in Canada. So it's still a question mark, and it hasn't been finalized yet, and you do see a lot of cherry picking. So I don't disagree with your question mark around, do I see a valid model yet? That's been open to a lot of interpretation.
I think the other thing is we're seeing there are some sectors for which this is increasingly important. If in the, for example, the mining sector or the textile mining sector in particular are beginning to look at measuring scope 3 because, again, they're looking for financing from global sources. So that's one of the issues here.
And one more thing too, the Canadian Securities Administrators for the CSA, Tyler, you had a question too, have they published new requirements? Not yet. So the evolution of what is happening currently in Canada, there is the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board that has been established. They have been looking at the international standards for sustainability reporting. They are making their recommendation for public comment here in March of this year. That public comment period, when it closes, they have to digest what Canada has said back and all the stakeholders who are involved in this economy. And that's what they're going to be recommending for the CSA to be considering. And now I don't know what the extent is for how long the CSA will take before it comes out with its recommendations, but I do know that CSA is looking directly south of the border to what the SEC is trying to accomplish, as that will directly influence our Canadian disclosure requirements. Here's the only caveat that I'll also add. We can't have 3 sets of standards, one for, and we're going to get into Europe, so what Europe is doing, one for Canada, one for the US, and trying to keep 3 sets of books. So when you see that term interoperability, it really means how do we record, understand, and report on something that can meet all 3 of those markets? That's going to be essential. So the compliance burden isn't here of trying to maintain separate disclosures and reporting those out to the different markets that you participate in. So that's when I look at CSA, if they come out with new requirements, not yet.
And I just wanted to respond to Catherine's question about companies of different sizes. I think it goes back to the industry that you're in. Again, if you're in the mining sector and you're looking for investment from outside of Canada, if you're an exporter, if you're, depending on who is providing funding or who is paying for your goods or services and what pressures they're under, to the point that Ed's making, that, there are things going on in Europe that are more pressing and more rigorous than here. So I don't think it's a question of company size. I think it's a question of what you do for a living, basically.
Yeah, and that's almost the perfect way to look at this global economy, Mary. It is exactly right. One of the things that we do when we ask our clients to look at their ESG requirements is, where do you participate? And what I mean by that is, where do you make sales of your goods, to whom, and where are they involved, and does it link to the global economy? Because something even like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, I don't know if many of you have heard of CBAM. It's kind of a fun one to say. But what it does is it's put a tax on imports or exports from Canada, but imports into the EU. They are trying to level the playing field that your environment has to align with the carbon restrictions in the EU. And if they don't, they penalize you through a tax before you can even sell into the European Union, to ensure that you are set up the same way under the same restrictions for greenhouse gas emissions and your carbon footprint as if you operated in the EU. So when you start looking at the global economy, it's important to say, who do I sell and do business with? Who do I access capital from? What are the requirements that are being expected of me? And because a lot of you on the call today are involved in the small, mid-sized enterprise or the mid-market for Canada, what the EU is starting to look at now. So they've already issued for public comment a small and mid-sized enterprise disclosure requirement for the EU. They're now moving into the global marketplace. Well, how do those SMEs, what do we need to see for them to do business with us? So this is even beyond that carbon border adjustment mechanism that we just talked about. And this is where we definitely are going to be involved with, well, what is the expectation on us as a country where the mid-market really does comprise the majority of our economy? We need to be aligned with what those expectations are, knowing that additional disclosures are coming. So if you want to continue to participate and do trade with the EU, including what the US will be coming out for the climate related reporting requirements, it's important to know that because that's contingent on you continuing trade. What is the disclosure? How do I measure? How do I get that in place?
Can I just address this question? Because we've been talking about getting financing, and this question from Sergey is very relevant. There was a conference a couple of weeks ago in Ottawa on the future of food, and the whole theme of the conference was sustainability, which is, if the agricultural sector is going to continue to grow in this country, which it needs to do, it needs to grow sustainably. So the issue is not that a farm will not be able to get financing. It will, especially if it's showing that it is on the road to trying to do things that will improve its overall GHG or other emissions or other usage of, for example, things like fertilizers. Are you making progress? Are you investing in things that are going to probably increase yields, will probably decrease your costs, hopefully over time? But I think there is a theme of people needing to see that there is investment being made. And there are, the company's machinery emitting more than it should. I think, again, most of businesses have, I think, begun to realize that investing in more sustainable practices actually are just good for the business overall. And the notion that you've recognized that there are opportunities and are starting to invest in reducing the use of electricity, for example, or making sure that your employees are have the proper safety standards that they need. That's kind of the way that I think most organizations are looking at this now. It's not, I think, punitive actions are not the rule of the day.
Yeah, and I like what Sergey has put into the Q&A. I kind of chuckle because when you consider the burping and farting, yes, there's always going to be methane. There's always going to be emissions. And so, Sergey, I appreciate that. Here's the one thing that we always make a recommendation to our clients. There is no one size fits all. If you have 80,000 plus head of cattle, yeah, we should be talking about a digester and look at renewable gas and the opportunity to reduce your carbon footprint. But that same approach does not apply if you only have 100 head of cattle. So again, this is about prudence and opportunity. Look where your concentration is. Well, I don't know where concentration is until I measure it. But we're going to unpack a little bit of that here today too, to say, if we know materially where we are exposed, then it opens up the door to, well, where should we actually be focusing? And then be very specific with your actions as opposed to, well, Mary did a biodigester, I have to. It doesn't work that way. There are opportunities to start understanding, raising awareness, and then being specific with your actions. So while I appreciate 100%, Sergey, what you're saying, it's not meant to be one of those, as long as we have humans and animals, let's just put it nicely, we're not going to get rid of that method. So I'll just leave it there for right now, Mary. If we go into Bill S-211, this is why everybody, or at least a lot of you, are here today. Mary, maybe you can kick us off with some of this as an overview.
Yeah, I think that again, we're talking about materiality. Bill S-211 was really designed to address supply chain issues that are pointed and specific and that are meaningful. So it's really along two dimensions. One is, what are the industries that are most at risk of modern slavery? And the electronics industry is one of them, garments, textiles, mining, gold, and sugarcane, interestingly enough. these are all sectors where very often forced labor, child labor, modern slavery is rampant around the world. And I think that so there are parts of the world like Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then some countries in South America that are, that raise red flags if they're part of your supply chain. And so Canada, as a member of the global economy, is saying we need to play our part. And on the next page, I think, we're seeing sort of where we sit. We're kind of late to the game on this. California figured this out in 2010. You see a lot of European countries and then actually across the EU putting in place laws that are working very similarly to S211 to fight against forced labor and child labor in supply chains. So I should say that the legislation that we have is considered to be among the best. It actually has fairly clear requirements and reporting requirements and has some teeth in it, which I'll talk about in a minute, or Ed will talk about. But we're really just getting on board with the rest of the world. This is not something that's happening in an isolated way. It is to help us continue to participate in the global economy. As I mentioned, this is a big issue. It's 50 to 60 million people that are embedded in these terrible situations. So there's something that does need to be done about this. So to whom does it apply? It basically applies to any entity that is involved, and then we'll get into the size issues, but it's manufacturing, producing, growing, extracting, which is interesting, or processing goods in Canada, where these, or where importing goods manufactured, produced, grown, extracted, or processed outside of Canada. And very importantly, if there is an entity controlling such an entity, there's a need to report as well. One of our clients is a retailer that does all of its activities outside of the US, but the controlling ownership of the retailer is in Canada. So there is a need for them to report. And this whole issue of an entity, what does it mean? It's a corporation, it could be a trust, it could be a partnership, it could even be an unincorporated organization. So the attempt here is to make it rather broad and to cover a broad range of activities where some aspect of modern slavery might be involved.
Yeah, and so this is basically that first filter of if you are not associated with goods, either the manufacturing, producing, growing, extracting, etc. If you are just service oriented, this doesn't apply to you. And that's where I think it's really important that we have to hit that filter first, because we've always been asked the question, I'm a service organization. Well, it's not goods. Don't worry about it. That's why it's so important to understand who does this apply. This is the first filter.
So yes, software as a service does not apply, for example. So the next issue is this these size issues. So a public company, if you are engaged in any of the activities that we just described on the previous page, you have to report regardless of size. And this basically means submitting a report that talks about what your risks are, and Ed's going to talk a little bit about this and what you're doing about them. And if you're a private enterprise, 2 of the 3 criteria need to be met. 20 million in assets, and as Ed just mentioned, it's gross assets, not net. Had generated at least $40 million in the least for at least one of the 2 most recent years, not both years, or employs an average of at least 250 employees. And what we're finding, I think, is most of the clients that we're working with right now are meeting those first 2 criteria more than the last one. But there are a lot of companies out there, and then probably many of them owned by you, that might meet these thresholds.
All right, we had a question come up, in fact, 2, and I'm going to ask you both. First one is, are there only certain countries for exports which require disclosure?
No, no, because what the supply chain investigation is looking for is more broadly, what risks might ensue. So even if you're importing goods from the US, from Europe or other countries, even Japan, the government wants to know as much as it possibly can about the sources of supply over time. So if their material, we're going to be taking a look at the sources of supply, irrespective of where the source country would be.
And so the second one is around the importing. Does it only apply to organizations that import? So Roger, thanks for the question. You don't import, but you do assemble in your fabrication shop. Does it apply if they meet the criteria?
Well, in this case, I mean, you are probably buying goods for the assembly. And so one of the things, for example, if you're in the automotive industry and fabricating parts for OEMs, but you are buying materials so that you can assemble the things that you are going to sell ultimately, the question is, have you asked your suppliers, the distributors, to make sure that what they're importing is free of forced labor? Now, you don't have to go back and investigate what they're doing, but this kind of insight into the supply chain ultimately is what the government's looking for. And one of the examples that we heard recently is building industry. For example, if you're building houses, it's unlikely that you're importing wood directly from Brazil. You're going through a distributor of some sort. Over time, I think what the government's going to be interested in is finding out that those big distributors, are they doing due diligence on the part of their suppliers to make sure that no forced labor is involved in the importing that they're doing. So there is a need to actually disclose, even if you're not importing directly.
Thanks, Mary. What needs to be reported? Well, it's really quite encompassing here around what the government is looking for. And we primarily put here on screen what is embedded in the Act. What they would like to know and what they're asking for a disclosure on is the structure. So this is as easily and succinctly as I can put it. What do you do? Where do you do it? And with whom do you do it? And the with whom is the part that extends into your supply chain. So it's about describing what you do, what products or services you're involved in. Well, wait, if it's services, we don't need to report, you're right. So we're going to be very focused on the products or the goods. And then of that, what is your process? Is it just importing and reselling? Well, now we're also looking at anywhere that you actually procure or import. Where does it come from? Because at the end of the day, when you map what you do, where you do it, and with whom you do it, now you have to run a risk assessment, which is also required by law, that says of all of where you operate, what are the potential exposures or the risks related to forced or child labor? Now, are there indices to be used? Yes, there are. Two that we fundamentally look to right now. One is called Walk Free, and the other is the U.S. Department of Labor. They evaluate and they update where they see the highest degree of forced labor and child labor. So in order to evaluate the risk, you do look at, and this is building on what Mary already said, the industry that you're involved in. If it's textile and clothing, then it's already a high risk. If you look at where your fabric is coming from, there are certain regions that are extremely high risk. If you are, and many of you may have read already about even in the Globe and Mail, shrimp and fishing vessels, if they're originating out of Asia, then how does that get reflected for forced labor on boats for shrimps? We have clients who import shrimp, and how did they start tracking where forced labor is at because they resell into Canadian markets? All of this needs to be completed because then it asks for, when you've mapped your business and you've done your risk assessment and you know where there's potential exposures, what's your due diligence? And they give guidance around due diligence. And it really does start with, when you look at suppliers, how did you onboard them? How do you monitor their activity? What information do you ask of them? There's a specific component in the Act that asks for, what is the training that you provide to your employees around forced and child labor? It is the entirety of how do you raise awareness, fight against forced and child labor, and how do you report on that back and put expectations on your supply chain? Now, here's some questions coming out that I know will be asked if they're not already in your minds. Is this going to be audited? Well, no, the government hasn't moved down an assurance path yet. They are looking for this, and this is very, very critical for everybody who's attending today. They are looking for a demonstration that you have taken their act, have looked at your business and your supply chain, have understand the potential exposures, and you're starting to improve or mature your due diligence practices. Does that mean you have to have boots on the ground at a manufacturing location in Indonesia? No, that's not what's being required yet. They're looking for the, how do you say, here's what we are doing? And if you're not, there's another critical takeaway, they're not looking for you to be risk-free by May 31st. They are asking for you to do an assessment, understand the gaps, and tell them, what are you doing to try and improve the environment to hold more accountability across your supply chain? So demonstration, not risk-free. And we're looking for the idea of maturing practices, which is why there's going to be specific things that you're going to need to work on to start improving what you do, how you do business, and with whom you do business. So that's the evolution around the maturation that's going to be required. Is there an eventuality? Will the government change legislation? Will there be additional requirements? Well, of course, I don't know what the government is going to do, but for right now, I do know what the expectation of this act is and how we're getting to the point of, do we assess that we're effective in this? Does anybody want to wake up in the morning and say, well, I've never thought about forced or child labor. I don't really take it seriously. Well, it's a reputational issue as well. There's an expectation growing around social issues when we look at what Mary and I were talking about earlier around ESG and sustainability. ESG is environmental, yes, and climate. Social issues are becoming paramount. Mary's going to talk a little bit more about EDI shortly, but this is where these type of social issues that come out as laws for compliance, well, how do we take labor force seriously? Now, if you're sourcing your labor directly from Canada and you've got all your requirements for onboarding and you know the ages of, and there's no exposure to forced labor, well, this is good. That's what you're showing. You're showing that you're at extremely low risk, but there still is a disclosure requirement. So to me, there is this that needs to be put into place. And sorry, I'm looking at my other screen when I'm doing this. But it's this that needs to be understood, and it has to go into a report that describes your business and your risk assessment and your due diligence. And many of you might even say, well, I don't do that, but I would like to. Perfect. There are gaps. Here's what we're going to work on over the next 12 to 18 months.
And so that kind of addresses Mark's question. So Mark's question is basically, he's saying there's no risk. So your report probably will be pretty easy to develop, but you do need to put that report together. Now, in terms of the suppliers, there may be risk. I don't know. I mean, without looking at the business. And so again, this addresses this issue of, you may be in a situation where there's no risk of forced labor, but the people who are supplying you, the distributors, whomever you're buying from, could be at risk. And the question about related companies, the whole issue of consolidation, the definitions are not terribly clear. I think what we've been doing is using judgment, which is if there's an owner with two businesses that, even if they're not consolidated, but they're definitely related and doing similar things, then typically those get reported together. So there is a judgment call that needs to be made, I think, typically.
Yeah, and if I could just build a little bit more on that, it goes back to your slide, Mary, where you talked about control. Now, this is where my accountant's hat comes on just for a moment. I promise to take it off. But the idea of control is based on either equity control or operational control. If you have control over that entity, and the act is very specific, including the guidance, if you have control over another entity that has control over another entity that is involved in any of these and all the definition of goods, all of that gets consolidated back up to you, and you would report as a single report. So when it comes down to related companies, my first challenge back, Brody, would be around the idea of, do you have control? How is that control established? What are the shareholdings? What does it look like? Who has operational control? And then make the determination with you. Because again, it's not a one size fits all. There's different corporate structures and tax structures, and we'd have to review that with you, but we can help you with that if you have additional questions.
And the question about heavy civil construction, if you are only selling services and acting as a general contractor and not actually dealing with the delivery of particular materials, then it may not apply to you. I think that's correct, Ed. You may have a different point of view about that.
Yeah. Sorry, I was reading down with the other questions here really quickly too, but that's right, Mary. I agree with you. In fact, the one I was focused on just is the municipalities, and then I'll move on to my next slide. There is a government requirement for disclosure, but it's at the federal government level and the crown corporations. Where we get into interpretation now is around the municipality and the idea of incorporation. Is a municipality incorporated, or a company they own, like a utility? Well, then that needs to be a determination by the municipality around that utility or incorporated business, as to how and if you actually do the disclosure. So again, it's one of those that we'd have to unpack with you. Municipalities on their own, the only place that you'll run into a little bit of a tripping hazard is around the incorporation side. So the corporate, that definition technically does fall under the act, but when you look at the intent of where the act was going for the small and mid-sized enterprises or anybody who does business around goods, that's where it was, well, government is at the federal level, not the municipality level. So there is some interpretation here, but that's where the intent was for government. I'll go to the next slide if that's okay.
Yep.
What?
We'll get back to you on other questions that you've raised in writing.
So what needs to be reported? Well, this is interesting. What needs to be reported? There are three different things. There's the actual report itself, and there's constraints around size. They recommend 10 pages, 20 if it's bilingual. They cap the size in PDF form at 100 megabytes, but there is a report. Then there is an online questionnaire that needs to be completed. So the content from the report and the questionnaire need to be the same. And the third component is an attestation. That's basically, I sign off that what is in the questionnaire and the report is true, accurate, and displays our identification of the risk and our fight against forced and child labor. That all gets submitted to the federal government. That now is going to go into a central repository or database that the government is going to make publicly available, kind of like a CDAR in a way for financials and AIF and MD&As for publicly listed companies. But they also want each one of you, if you're required to report, to put it in a prominent location on your website. And the additional requirement, which is at the bottom of your page, if you have shareholders, when you provide the financials to them, you provide your report along with those financials at the same time. So again, three components go in federally. It's every year by May 31st. There is the report needs to be submitted on a prominent location on your website, and you need to give it to your shareholders as well, along with the financial statements. That's what we wanted to hit for content, but including additional questions that I see coming right now, Mary, I'm going to throw our pictures being bigger now on screen. I wanted to ask you, Mary, if you were to look at the topics of greatest importance to address right now, what would it be and why?
If I'm a company, if I'm an owner of a company?
Yeah, for all of those who are here watching us today.
So I think that what I first would do is say, well, what's material would be important. So if I'm ensuring, if I'm farming, if I'm actually using a lot of electricity, and if I'm potentially emitting greenhouse gases, I would want to make sure that I'm measuring scope 1, scope 2, and doing a pretty good job of that. If I'm in the people business, if I'm running a financial institution, if I'm running a credit union, if I'm, we have a lot of people in selling goods, retail industry or whatever, I might be much more interested in things around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Am I doing things do I have an ESG strategy or an EDI strategy? Have I started to look at ways to increasing diversity and inclusion in my workforce? And I think that good housekeeping around governance would be important things as well. I think there are issues around data security and data protection that kind of cross the S and the G side of things. But so much of this is really related to what it is you do, what your business is all about. So I don't think there's a one answer to this, but I do think that this question of materiality is absolutely crucial. If you're a manufacturing business and you're talking way too much about cutting ribbons and sending out food baskets at Christmas, which is a really good thing to do, but that's all your reporting is about, then I think this is going to be problematic.
Oh, we did have a question here, and Sandra, thank you for bringing it up. How can you prove or see that forced labor is occurring in a company that is a part of your supply chain? This is unique, and we've got an incredible mix of clients across the country already. Some I couldn't believe already that they said we've already been on site in foreign countries looking at their manufacturing, their inputs that go to what we import into Canada. Well, that's an extreme case where it's not consistent across the board. So where do you start if you actually don't go put boots on the ground in a foreign jurisdiction where your supplier is hailing from? Well, you can even start with making them aware there is a new law in Canada. We need to be inquiring of our supply chain. And here's some initial questions that we put into a supplier questionnaire that we would like to hear from you. And it's very much around the due diligence that we've been talking about of what you're going to need for your organization. Do you have a policy related to forced and child labor? How do you vet that it doesn't exist in what you do, let alone those that you have in your supply chain? There's questions to unpack and to get an idea from them. Is this something that's on their radar or not? Here's the part. You could have anybody disclose in a supplier questionnaire anything they think you want to hear, and there's no vetting of it, which is why I see that there's going to be an evolution around the requirement for if there's a disclosure, how do we prove that your disclosure is accurate? It's not just enough to say, don't worry, Ed, there's no forced labor in my supply chain, and yet I can go and see exactly you have children working for you. No, it's going to be something more along the line of, do we see an evolution where it's you're going to need somebody to prove it? It's not in the act yet. Is that a future expectation? When we look at global disclosure requirements around forced labor as well, and we had that slide a little bit earlier, there is building in now more of the rigor with how do you prove what you're hearing back? How do you work with your suppliers to take this as an important topic for you? How do you ensure that if they can't report back to you and refuse to report back to you, that you have to start making some decisions around, are there other suppliers who do want to work and do want to provide? And now it's an adjustment of the economy to force bad actors out of the equation. So there's an eventuality of the maturity here of the process.
Which, by the way, is one of the objectives that of this whole act in the first place is one of the ways in which this is going to end is with the people who are fomenting this kind of activity being forced out of business. I think the other thing just to add to that is agency protection is no longer adequate. You can't just say you didn't know and it was too far away. If it's material, you at some point you may need to have boots on the ground if it's a material issue and there is a sense of increase of significant risk, or you may just have to look for alternate suppliers. The next question I'm going to ask Ed actually relates to the two questions I think that Carly and Carmen have put forth, which is what kinds of disclosures, not just for S211, but more generally, will organizations need to prepare? What are they going to look like? Are these going to be business-to-business disclosures? Are they going to be, what kind of structured reporting is going to be out there? Because I think it's right now kind of a black hole for most organizations.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This goes back to the point around climate, and it's a hard thing to harp on right now, but it is a reality. The number one global agenda item is climate. You can even look at the two standards that have been globally accepted, are not mandatory in Canada yet, so we're seeing what will apply here. But of the two standards, there's one that deals with all material topics and one that deals with climate. They've taken the all material topics and they've given a 1-year relief. Push it back because what we want is climate. So when I consider that I love that question, Mary, around business to business disclosures. In the absence of the Canadian Securities Administrators coming out and saying for our capital markets, this is what you need to report on, we're already seeing that greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint are critical. So to me, that's the number one thing. It doesn't even have to be in a fancy report. How did you identify and inventory your greenhouse gas emissions, and did you quantify it? And do you have a number available to go, hey, we've taken a look, we've measured, you wanted to know, here's where it's at. The good thing with doing an exercise that way is also going to show you where you're concentrated, because a follow-up question beyond just what is your carbon footprint, what are you doing to try and reduce that carbon footprint? So it's two things that come very closely together, calculation, but also are you looking at opportunities to try and reduce it? That is critical. That is something that is an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions that, if you say, well, I don't even know what that means, this seems like an academic exercise and it's going to add no value. How many of you, when you get your electricity statement, go in or have your bookkeeper enter the expense for the month that you received it? The little extra piece that's in there is called kilowatt hours. Having that in addition to the expense allows us to start calculating based on electricity that you consume in your business, what the GHG emissions are that get attributed to you. So it's just a simple extra step that you'd want to do. It's not something where we have to go and radically change our business or our environment. There is an evolution here of, you've already collected it, you already have the statement. I'm asking for one more piece off that statement that we collect. That's it. How do we do that for the other emissions that we do need to inventory? Business to business is, what's your number? How are you reducing? When it comes to more formalized disclosures, that's where it's going to be very specific. And here's the framework, the format, and the look and feel that they're going to prescribe.
Great.
I did want to ask you a quick question too here, Mary. If you consider everything, because you talked around materiality right now, and it seems to be an evolution around the definition of materiality. How do you know what is most material? To those who are attending today, we talked about, yes, climate is going to be one, you can't get away from it. How do you get your head wrapped around, I can't do everything, so what do I focus on?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that to some degree, when we work with our clients who are wrestling with this issue, some of it is a judgment that one makes about one's own business. So, one would say, if I look across the range of environmental, social, and governance issues, and taking a very hard look at the things that I do in my business that are most important to the functioning of my business and to long-term success, that kind of self-reflection will yield an answer. So I think as I said before, if you are in a business that is really focused around people, but you've also got a number of stores. So, you could be looking at your footprint of your stores and the people who work in them. And you might, come out and say, well, I ought to be thinking about the electricity and the energy that's being used in my stores. And I need to make sure that I'm thinking about ESG or EDI issues. The other thing, though, that it is important is to ask your stakeholders. So if you're operating in a community, what do they think is important? What do they think is material about your business? Ask your customers, ask your partners, because that may lend some light on some issues that you might not have thought were as important in reporting, but that they think are crucial issues. And a lot of it could come out, for example, if you're, in a location where you're potentially having an impact on communities and properties that they own, asking them some questions about what they think are most important, most material about your business and the things you're going to be doing going forward and the investments you're going to be making and the growth that you're pursuing will lend some light to this. So I think it's an exercise in self-reflection and in stakeholder engagement to identify those things. What's crucially important is to pick the 3 or 4 or 5 things that you and they care about, to direct where you're going to be spending your time in reporting.
Yeah, and there was a question that even asked around the whole double materiality side. What is that? Well, to really make it as simple as possible, it is what is the impact of the external environment on you as a business, and then the flip side of your business on that environment. And maybe this is an overused example, but you're Coca-Cola. I consume water to make beverages. That is my impact on the environment. I consume a lot of water. However, with water shortages, is that water available for me to make beverages? It's the flip side of it as well. So you're looking at your impact on and also the impact of it on your business and operations. We can look to Alberta right now and we look at agriculture and we see the drought conditions. Drought conditions have a significant impact on agriculture if we're not considering how reliant we are on the use of water and where water does go and our treatment of water. Then it becomes an issue where I can't produce food, would now have an even larger macro issue on the Canadian economy, let alone the world that we export to. So there is really a big understanding here that has to say double materiality. What's the topic? How do we look at the inside out and the outside in? It's critical. And a lot of times when I see materiality, I always say, here's your really easy solution. If something is required by law, it's material, that's an easy find. I have to report on slave labor in my supply chain. Okay, one of the questions here too was, how far do we keep digging down that supply chain? Well, the essence is, all right, you import coffee beans. All right, you import them into Canada. Where do they come from? A US wholesaler, so we're good, right? No, you're not. You need to be asking your wholesaler, what is your policy? What is your process? This industry is a high risk already to forced labor. How do you ensure what you buy is ethically sourced? You need to understand that. How is that going to move? Is it all going to be done by May 31st of this year? Not at all. Is there an expectation being set? I think that's a critical takeaway. There is a
Yeah.
change in mindset, a change in expectation. We now need more information. How do I communicate it with you? What am I getting back? And am I discerning around that's not good enough and we need more? That's the evolution here that I see it moving. Now, Mary, I know we're getting close to time. I
Yeah.
have to ask you about social issues.
Aha. Yes.
This is a significant area, and we've already talked about Bill S-211, and it's about labor and the treatment of labor. But where do you see leading practice around EDI? How does that influence or impact everybody who's attending today?
Well, I think increasingly it is, although, as you pointed out, TCFD is looking at environment first, because climate change and kind of these issues that we've been talking about quite a bit are very much a global concern right now. Increasingly, I think, and partly as a result of COVID and changing attitudes, and frankly, what younger people in the workforce are looking for from their work and working environment, and the growing complexity and diversity of the Canadian population. Issues around equity, diversity, inclusion are growing, and I think that one of the things that is absolutely obvious is everybody is on the search for labor and for employees who are loyal and the people who want to stay in a particular entity. There, by the way, industries that are facing absolutely life-changing concerns. The agricultural industry is seeing a die-off and a retirement of farmers, and across all these sectors. And there's going to be a need for 100,000 new people entering the sector in the not too distant future. So I think a lot of business imperatives are coming to the fore and saying that, equity, diversity, inclusion is something that we really need to pay attention to. And what we're seeing, I think, increasingly is businesses not trying to be performative, not just coming out with an affirmation statement, not just saying that we are committed to blah, 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 because frankly, most people look at that and say it is blah, blah, blah. What are you really doing? Are you hiring differently? Are you actually treating all of your employees in a fair way when it comes to promotion and pay? If you're hiring people from equity deserving groups, do they actually stay with your company? If they leave, why are they leaving? And if an organization is trying to hire new people, there are lots of ways in which those people who are prospective employees will look at your organization, your website, talk to people who've left or who are working there. They will find out whether this is an environment that they want to work in, and they will march with their feet. So it's becoming a business issue. It's not just a nice thing to do. I think one of the things that is absolutely clear is none of this is about quotas. None of this is about preventing people from advancing in their careers. There is so much of a need for more people at this point to fill the job openings that we have to basically fuel growth, that this is becoming something that almost any organization needs to pay some attention to. And, oh, by the way, it is part of the questioning that happens if you're selling overseas, if you're looking for financing. Questions about equity, diversity, and inclusion are being asked at the same time that people are asking about environmental factors. So I think it's here to stay for sure. One thing that I think is critical is that when you look at sustainability reports, very often there are lots of nice measures around on the environmental side, but there aren't measures on the people side. And so what we encourage, what we see as being kind of best practice is, pick one or two things, again, that are material to your business. Talk about the things that you're doing, whether it's changing environment, hiring practices, or putting in, measuring your census on a year-to-year basis. But just make sure that there's some measures in there so that they're meaningful. And this is not about quotas or setting quotas, but it is an area that needs to be treated with the same kind of rigor and discipline that the environmental side gets.
Thanks, Mary. I appreciate that. I know we're almost at time. So the one thing I do want to say is, too many times we see that the three letters of ESG are tied to a politicizing of the concept and the approach. I think when we peel back the people in politics and we look at, is it our exposure to you, and we talk about business resiliency, we're here to ensure that who you do business with, you can continue to do business with, that you can trust them, that you're moving a dial to make you, yes, still create value and profitability, but doing it in a meaningful way. If that means having to understand greenhouse gas emissions, there's ways to move that forward. It's not a make work exercise. It's actually really good insight and understanding that there is something we can do that might even cut my costs. Well, I didn't know that until I actually went through what we call a baseline calculation. There's a good way to review it. I would say right now, the biggest risk, instead of looking at it as an opportunity, is because it's been politicized. And I think if we remove that, we're sitting on a tremendous opportunity to still drive value. And especially with Canada wanting to participate in a global stage, if we need capital and we want to sell to other countries, there's a growing requirement around our due diligence. Now, there were a lot of questions in here that have been asked today. We're going to take all of those. Yes, we'll make sure that this deck and this webinar has been disclosed out to all of those who are in attendance, and we're going to do our best to answer all the questions as well to come back to you. I thank you so much for joining today. We're at this cusp of an economy that still continues to change, and I'm happy we're part of the change, because I know status quo in any world is not good. It's a matter of how do we continue to change and generate value. That's a preeminent need for all of us. That's why even we here at MMP are so focused on the mid-market. That's where we spend all of our time, and we're very concerned, but see the opportunity that's involved in this entire discussion. If you have other questions, please do reach out to us. So thank you so much.
And wait. And Sandra, water is as important. It's a biodiversity and water. It's all dependent on what's material to your business. So yes, it's hugely important. So I just wanted to shout that out.
Perfect. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everybody, for attending.